Good day. Today is Saturday, 20th December 2025. And before proceeding with this program, let me remind you again to tick the like button if once you've watched the program or whichever part of the program you want to watch, you decide that you liked the program and wish to indicate that fact. Now, even as I am making this program, there are reports that Kirill Dmitriev, the head of Russia's Direct Investment Fund, a Russian businessman, a businessman who's also undertaken business in the United States itself, and an aide and advisor to President Putin of Russia, is flying to Miami to meet with Witkoff and Kushner to discuss the state of the peace negotiations. I will touch on all of this later in this program, but I'm going to focus first on the repercussions, the momentous repercussions of the European Union's decisions yesterday, its decision to grant a 90 billion euro loan to Ukraine, ultimately payable out of the Union's own budget, and its failure, by contrast, to float a different type of loan, a 140 billion euro loan, secured against the collateral provided by the frozen Russian assets held in Euroclear. And by the way, shortly after that decision, shortly after the decision to drop the frankly disastrous idea of providing Ukraine with funding that would have misappropriated the Russian assets in Euroclear, the British government, which we now know, has been strongly pushing this plan, the plan to float a loan by the European Union using the Russian assets in Euroclear as collateral. Anyway, the British government had to drop its plan to do the same thing, to float a loan for Ukraine. Apparently, the plan was that it would be an £8 billion loan, which would have used as collateral frozen Russian state assets in Britain. Now, this has been a major blow for Britain, or at least it's actually not been a blow for Britain at all. It's been a deliverance, I would say, for Britain. But it has been a blow for Prime Minister Keir Starmer and for the British officials who remain committed, feverishly, fervently committed to supporting Ukraine in this war. And the reports say that at the moment, Britain is not in a position to provide any further lending to Ukraine at all. We've had dribbles of reports over the last few hours coming out of Britain, which do provide some indication of the kind of support that Britain is currently providing to Ukraine. And by the way, it corroborates the figure of £5 billion a year provided to Ukraine by Britain, which has been mentioned many times by my friend Ian Proud, the former British diplomat. I never doubted Ian Proud's sources for this or his reliability on this question. But I've noticed that in the media in London, finally we've had squirreled away admissions about the funding that Britain is providing to Ukraine. It's broken down into various segments, but when you put them all together, it does indeed come to the figure of £5 billion. There is apparently some plan embraced by Keir Starmer himself to provide Ukraine with some £2 billion, which are the proceeds of Roman Abramovich's sale of his stake in the Chelsea Football Club. According to the British government, Abramovich was supposed to provide all that money to Ukraine. He'd apparently made a promise to do that. He might have done. I personally know nothing about it, but I'm not going to pretend that I know everything there is to know about these things, and it may be something that I missed. But anyway, there is some talk of providing that money to Ukraine, which would be, in a way, stealing the money from Roman Abramovich, which might, by the way, have long-term repercussions on the willingness of Russian businessmen to place money in London even after the war ends, and even if after sanctions are lifted, assuming that ever happens. And for the record, I happen to know that there is extensive funding provided historically by Russian businessmen, especially in the British university sector, with some Oxford and Cambridge colleges having received substantial sums of money from Russia. But anyway, apart from this attempt to seize and use Mr. Abramovich's money to support Ukraine, apparently the only further thing that the British government is able to do at the moment is to provide Ukraine with further security guarantees. In other words, provide Ukraine with credit guarantees. In other words, an arrangement whereby Ukraine can itself borrow money and the British government provides some kind of guarantee in case Ukraine defaults. So no direct money, no actual further funding from London. And bear in mind, whatever credit guarantees Britain gives, at this particular moment, it may be that investors, global investors, are not going to be especially keen to take up Ukrainian debt. And there is a good reason why. And that brings me now directly back to the question of this 90 billion euro loan that the European Union is providing. Now, the first point I want to make here is that we need to understand who is actually going to bear the cost of this loan. The European Union is going to provide Ukraine with 90 billion euros. It is called a loan to Ukraine, but Ukraine is not required to repay it. The repayment, supposedly, is going to come from Russia. And the Russians are going to repay a loan once the war is ended out of the reparations that they are supposedly going to agree to pay Ukraine. Now, already that makes absolutely no sense at all. You are lending money to Ukraine, not against a debt that another country, in this case Russia, owes to Ukraine, because as far as I'm aware, Russia has no debt at all to Ukraine. On the contrary, it is the other way round. It is Ukraine which owes money to Russia on previous debts, debt funding, loans that Russia has extended to Ukraine. So the Russians don't owe Ukraine any money, but the European Union is saying that at some future time, the Russians must pay an unspecified amount of money to Ukraine once they have lost the war by way of reparations to Ukraine, and out of that money, some of the loan, the 90 billion euro loan to Ukraine, is going to be paid back. Now, that is already, to say mildly, deeply unconventional financial practice. What if the Russians win the war, as they are in fact doing? What if the Russians refuse to pay reparations? who pays back the loan then? Not Ukraine? Not Russia? Does it just go on lying on the books, the European Union's books, indefinitely? If this loan is going to be floated in the international financial markets, the bondholders, the people who will buy the bonds that make up this loan, are at some point going to ask for their money back. Not just the interest that the European Union is going to pay them, but pay them on the bonds, but their capital as well. The pressure to repay the capital is going to grow. And at some point in the future, at some unknown time, that capital will be repaid. And if the Russians aren't repaying it, and the Ukrainians aren't repaying it, and if these bonds must be paid out of the European budget, then of course the European Union will have to repay the capital. And, well, the capital, the debt, will then have to be passed to the European states. So the taxpayers of the European states are going to have to pay the capital on the loan, minus, of course, the three who managed to carve out exemptions: Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. And, well, that means that at some point in the future, the 90 billion euro loan, the capital on it, the bonds, are going to have to be redeemed by European Union governments. Well, that's already very bad, but notice that we are looking at, in effect, an indefinite loan. An indefinite loan, as I said, which will presumably be floated on the international bond markets. I mean, this seems to be what people are talking about. Or perhaps European governments will lend money to the European Union, but nobody is saying this, so I presume it will be on the on the global bond markets. After all, if this was a case of direct funding by European states to the European Union to cover this loan, well, in practice, it wouldn't be a loan at all. So I'm assuming this is going to be raised by bonds floated on the international money markets, bonds which the Europeans are going to have to repay at some point, that the taxpayers of European states are going to have to repay, but which will be repaid at some unknown time in the future. Now, that makes these bonds very unattractive, I would have thought, to international investors, because they're going to be saying to themselves, well, we're asked to put up 90 billion euros to fund Ukraine, but we don't know when we're going to get our money back. It might be in a year's time, or in 5 years' time, or it might be in 10 years' time, but we've not been given any actual date. Now, this is very unusual with bond issues. To say that it's unusual would be an understatement. Nearly all bonds that I'm aware of, government bonds, have an expiry date, but these bonds presumably will have none. Now, lenders, some investors, some international investors, might be willing nonetheless to buy these bonds, despite the fact that the date of capital repayment is unknown. But inevitably, they are going to demand a very high interest premium on these loans, on these bonds, if they are going to make any money from them. I've seen figures of an interest rate of 3%. I would not be surprised if it turns out much higher. And of course, the more remote the prospect of receiving repayment from either Russia or Ukraine becomes, the higher the yield on these bonds inevitably is going to be. And who is going to pay that interest? Well, the interest will have to be paid out of the European Union's budget. So what that means, since it is the member states who fund the budget, it means that the member states, Germany, France, Italy, all of them, are going to have to contribute enough funds to the budget every year to cover the interest cost of this loan, which is probably increasing and growing all the time. Now, it's been pointed out that the European Union's budget is, I believe, well, it is big, and the interest payments on this loan, if they're 3%, though I think they could quite easily be more than 3%. Anyway, we're not talking about back-breaking sums. But back-breaking sums, they might not be, but they are an extra burden at a time when all European economies, all the big European economies, are in severe debt, and the debt is getting worse. Moreover, this 90 billion euro loan comes on top of other loans of a similar nature, also floated through bond issues on the basis of the European budget, which have been agreed and authorized before. There was, for example, not that you hear much about it, but there was a bond issue some years ago, I believe it was in 2021, for 750 billion euros, which was intended to provide recovery funds to European member states following the pandemic. There is interest repayable on these bonds also, and at some point these bonds also are going to mature. They are being underwritten by European governments, which means that the cost of these bonds is going to be passed on to the European taxpayers. I believe that there are other debts which have been floated in a similar way, floating around the system as well. Now, when the Europeans issued that big 750 billion euro recovery loan program back, I think, in 2021, there were high expectations that there would be a rapid economic recovery across Europe after the end of the pandemic. That obviously has not happened, and one of the reasons it has not happened is because of the war. I discussed yesterday in my program how, according to the Financial Times, there has been a report just published in Britain which says that because of the pressures, the economic pressures, including the cost of energy, of fertilizer and of feed, and the Financial Times article itself made it clear that all of these costs are connected to the economic war between the West and Russia. It is no longer profitable for English farmers to produce food. That was what the Financial Times said, and that is apparently what this report says. So the economic pressures across Europe are growing, and they're growing all the time, and debt levels are rising. France is struggling with a debt to GDP ratio of over 120%. I believe that in Italy it's higher still. I believe in Spain it is also high. In Germany it continues to be lower, but Germany is increasing its debt to GDP ratio at warp speed because of Chancellor Merz's various programs which are intended to achieve German rearmament and a infrastructure renaissance, but which are achieving none of these things. So debt levels are already high, and adding to those debt levels a 90 billion euro loan of this kind with potentially very high interest costs is going to create problems. It is inevitably going to create tensions, as the cost of supporting the European Union, the cost of supporting the European budget increases. Inevitably, in member states, as people face increasing pressures and as the domestic budgets of the member states increase, as the pressures on the budgets increase, there's going to be complaints about handing over more money to Europe, to the European institutions, to fund their various budgets and their various budget costs. And here, now, we see interest costs, which will continue to affect the budget as well. And this, of course, connected to previous interest costs incurred as a result of the previous 750 billion loan issue and other loan issues that are swirling around the system as well. So this is going to create growing problems, especially if the interest rate rises. And of course, there's a lot of talk about Eurobonds, and I have no doubt at all that the European Commission is very, very keen to move forward to Eurobonds with all the mechanisms for direct taxation that go with that. And the southern European debtor states, Italy, Spain, Greece, to some extent I suspect France, would not be unhappy about this. But then the original idea about Eurobonds was predicated very much on an assumption of low German debt to GDP ratios, with Germany therefore able to cover the cost of the Eurobonds, thereby in effect enabling southern states, the Mediterranean states, to spend money, if I'm going to say it bluntly, to run up debt, in effect using a shared credit guard, the cost of which would be borne by Germany. But what if Germany cannot afford to do that? Cannot afford to do that now because its own debt to GDP ratio is deteriorating and the German industrial economy is weakening, and Germany's previously extremely strong current account balance is weakening as well. What if this causes greater opposition in Germany to funding of the budget? One can very easily see how this could be controversial in Germany, bearing in mind that European law, for the moment, says that Eurobonds are illegal. So, with this decision that has just been made yesterday, the European Union is creating severe future problems for itself. It was one thing in a time of relative optimism in 2021 to float a massive bond issue to finance European recovery. It's a completely different thing to float another bond issue to finance a war that is being lost in another country, which is not in fact a member of the European Union. And to do that as well at a time when economic conditions across the Union are going from bad to worse and when debt levels in general are rising. But it gets worse than this, because as I discussed in my programme yesterday, I am not sure that Ukraine is actually going to receive 90 billion euros. That's the first thing to say. Now, I have been scanning the media over the last 24 hours in order to understand what the structure of this loan actually is. When it was a question of the 140 billion euro loan, which would have used the Russian assets as collateral, then it was clear there would be 100 billion euros provided to Ukraine and 40 billion euros provided to repay an earlier loan of 40 billion euros owed by Ukraine to the European Union. Now, there has been no clarification of this point that I have seen. The media seem either ignorant of this question or perhaps unwilling to discuss it. To repeat again, if the entire 90 billion euro loan represents money that is going to Ukraine, so Ukraine is going to get 90 billion euros, then that presumably means that the European Union has agreed to roll over the 40 billion euro loan that is still on the books. In which case, the total lending is not 90 billion euros to Ukraine. It is in effect 130 billion euros. And the 90 billion euro figure that we see being quoted around is wrong. Since I have not seen that said anywhere, I continue to assume, as I discussed in my programme yesterday, that it is 50 billion euros for Ukraine and 40 billion euros to repay the previous loan. In which case, Ukraine is getting half the money that it wanted. Now, there has been some clarification about the state of Ukraine's budget. We're told that the planned budget deficit for Ukraine next year is 43 billion euros. So a 50 billion euro infusion will just cover it. But everybody knows, and I say that everybody knows, that this 43 billion euro deficit figure is fiction. The true deficit, the true size of the deficit is going to be much bigger. I've seen estimates that say 60 billion euros, in which case this 50 billion euros that Ukraine is getting is not going to cover the deficit. And that is on the basis of existing estimates. If things go badly wrong next year in Ukraine, as they will, then of course the situation is going to deteriorate much faster, the deficit will grow further, and the loan will be unable on the existing sums to plug any of the holes. And already we are seeing statements from Kiev, from various people within the Ukrainian parliament and other people within the Ukrainian political system who are running around making exactly that point. They are saying, all of them, that this money that's being provided is not going to be enough. It is not going to be enough to cover Ukraine for 2 years. Absolutely not. It's difficult to see how it is going to cover Ukraine for 1 year. In practice, it is impossible that it can cover Ukraine for 1 year. There is going to be a financial crisis in Ukraine next year unless extra sources of funding are found. So where are those sources of funding going to come from? Well, the US Congress has just passed a big defense appropriation bill, and it has allocated $800 million for Ukraine to be paid to Ukraine over 2 years. So that's $400 million in 2026 and $400 million in 2027. This is trivial. It is not going to cover more than a few weeks of spending at most. If we're talking about tens and hundreds of billions, 400 million in any 1 year, here or there, is not going to make any difference. The fact that the Congress has authorized funding for Ukraine is bad. The fact that it has authorized so little funding suggests that enthusiasm for funding Ukraine in the United States has indeed drained away, and even the Democrats, who remain openly supportive, strongly supportive of Ukraine, are now becoming unwilling to propose additional extra funding beyond these sums, which in terms of the US budget are rounding out errors, just to say. So it doesn't look for the moment as if the United States is willing to provide billions upon billions of extra funding. I suspect that if there is a new Congress after the midterm elections next year, there will still be reluctance to increase significantly funding for Ukraine. It will still be unpopular, so unpopular that even Democrats will balk at doing it, and doing it in a way that might give extra points for Donald Trump and the Republicans to make in the election, the further election, which is coming in 2028. So obviously this could change. There is still strong support for Ukraine within the political class and the deep state in the United States. But it doesn't seem for the moment as if this is translating into significant extra funding. And, well, that may change, but it doesn't seem likely to change at the moment. Then, of course, there are the financial agencies, the IMF and the World Bank. Appallingly, these two agencies have been providing support to Ukraine ever since the political crisis, the Maidan revolution, the revolution of dignity, the coup, whatever you want to call it. They continued to support Ukraine after Ukraine went effectively into default in 2015. And, well, they have done so up to now. But some of the commentaries that have been coming out of the IMF are starting to suggest that even they now are reaching the limit of their ability to continue to support Ukraine in the way that they have. They have bent and broken their rules to do it. They've invested enormous sums in Ukraine, continuing to send more money to Ukraine in the way that they are doing is becoming increasingly contentious within the IMF's board and is starting to put the IMF itself in fiscal jeopardy, all the more so given that it ultimately relies on cash injections from its members, including the Western powers, to keep itself going. And what about the European Union? Well, I've already discussed its mounting problems. Why did the European Union come up with this plan, this very contentious plan, to go for a loan using the Russian assets as collateral? Everybody could see how contentious and legally risky that was. Well, the reason that Merz and Ursula and Kaja Kallas and Fredriksen in Denmark and the Swedish government and Keir Starmer, all of these people were giving, was because the European Union, with its debt issues, it's just declining its economy, its ever increasing tax burdens on its people, that it was running into reaching the limits of the funding it could give Ukraine. And the same, of course, is true of Britain as well. And bear in mind, going back to what I said earlier, Keir Starmer and his government, ardent supporters of Ukraine that they are, now that they've had to drop the idea of a further loan to Ukraine using Russian assets frozen in Britain as collateral, they are reduced to scrabbling around for the £2 billion of Mr. Abramovich's assets, but mostly now they're reduced to offering Ukraine credit guarantees, which of course might eventually end by costing more money to the British government. But the British government is not in a position to put up much more in the way of hard cash. And frankly, I suspect that the time will come when it's not prepared to provide credit guarantees either. So in summary, when Ukraine runs into problems next year, financial problems next year, which it will, as of today, it is looking much less likely that it is going to be able to find further funding from the European Union, from Britain, or from the United States. It was the Europeans themselves and the British themselves who were going around saying that the limits had almost been reached and that the only way forward was to use the Russian money. We can see why. Already this €90 billion loan is going to create problems, not, as I said, back-breaking problems, but it's going to add to the overall and increasingly heavy debt load in ways that will have an effect. And, well, I am far from confident that they can go back in 6 months' time and do the same again. And I'm far from confident that if they do, European states are going to support it and that the financial markets will continue to support it, assuming that they are prepared to support it even now. Of course, they might in the summer, let's assume it is the summer, revisit the topic of seizing the Russian assets all over again. Putin had something rather interesting to say about all of this over the course of his press conference, by the way. He was asked about the stealing, as it was put to him, of, this is of course a question from the Russian media. The Russian media asked him to comment about the fact that the Europeans appeared to have dropped the idea of stealing the Russian assets. And Putin responded, the assets are not being stolen. Theft implies that this is something that is being done in secret. This is being done openly and publicly. The right word for this, in other words, is not theft, but robbery. And indeed, judging from his words, if you base your analysis on his words, what was being suggested would have been the biggest bank robbery in history. And of course, he would say, if it is suggested again in the summer of 2026, it will be the biggest bank robbery all over again. Now, those are Putin's words, but we've seen that there is an accumulation of legal opinions that support it. The IMF, the ECB, Euroclear itself have all basically indicated that they agree with these words. So does the Belgian government, the existing Belgian government. So apparently do other European governments also. Now, things can change, governments might change, but De Wever may no longer be Prime Minister of Belgium in 6 months' time, though Belgian public opinion has strongly supported him over this issue. It may be, however, that he is gone and a more accommodating leader takes his place. It might be that Meloni, who's also been opposed to this idea, that she is replaced by someone more accommodating also. Though it seems to me much more likely that if Meloni were to go, which I don't expect, by the way, over the next 6 months, the person who would take over would probably be Matteo Salvini, who, as far as I can tell, shares Orban's view that it is a mistake to continue to fund Ukraine because the war there is lost. So, having said that, things can change. People become desperate. They might feel desperate enough to continue to fund Project Ukraine. They might decide in the summer to come after the Russian assets after all. Well, that would be a major crisis. But isn't it more likely that having backed off doing it this winter, if they find themselves in the same position again, facing the prospect of doing something from a much weaker position than the one they have been in up to now, that they will back off a second time? In which case, what will they do? Well, Thomas Fazi, on his Substack blog, has pointed out that the European Union likes to work in false binaries. Ursula von der Leyen suggested to the European Council that there was a choice between two options: the catastrophe of funding Ukraine with a loan secured against the frozen Russian assets, or the mere disaster, which is the one we have, and the one which was adopted, which was to fund the Ukraine through the 90 billion euro loan, which is what they have done. The third option, which is not to fund Ukraine at all, which is the sensible one, well, that, of course, was never proposed. The European states were given the choice between the catastrophe that they balked from or the disaster which instead they adopted. But if we find ourselves again in the same position in the summer, with the economic situations worse, is there not at least a greater chance that this time they will back off? Now, to repeat again, prior to this meeting of the European Council, there was already much commentary that the European Union's ability to fund Ukraine was reaching its limits. If that is true, if there is any truth to it, then that will be even more true in the summer. And when Ukraine faces its crisis in the summer, it's quite likely that the ability of the European Union, of the European states, to bail it out that time will have melted away. You can argue, and by the way, I would argue, that the United States, with much greater ability to fund Ukraine, basically it hit its limits last year, which is why after the change of administrations, funding to Ukraine from the United States drastically reduced. European states individually began to reach their limits this year. It's been pointed out by many sources that nearly all of the European states have began to reduce their funding to Ukraine significantly from about midsummer. Germany being the one exception. So Germany funds Ukraine to the tune of about €1 billion a month, but other states support for Ukraine, financial support for Ukraine over the course of 2025 has basically melted away. Is it not at least possible? Is it not in fact mathematically likely that, given the realities, financial support for Ukraine midsummer is going to melt away as well from the European Union and its institutions too? In which case, when the reckoning comes, sometime around the summer, Ukraine is going to find itself in the worst position it has ever been in. It will find itself faced with liabilities and costs it simply cannot cover, but with the sources of funding it has been getting from the West starting to dry up. Now, that, it seems to me, is the mathematics of this. Of course, there is politics. Politics has bent mathematics, where questions of Ukraine have been concerned ever since the 2014 crisis. In a rational world, funding for Ukraine should have been scaled down long ago, and instead, foolishly, it has been scaled up. But I would suggest that the limits of this, of even this, are starting to fall away, are starting to be reached. And however strong the commitment to Ukraine politically continues to be, there is little that can be done when governments start to hit their financial limits. So that gives us a sense of perhaps the future course of the war. Now, a couple of days ago, a week or so ago, as I discussed previously, I received an email, a private email, from an extremely well-informed person who discussed with me, with great deal of circumstantial, and in fact not just circumstantial, but factual information that he had about Ukrainian losses. And he predicted that if the current trends on the battlefronts continue, the Ukrainian army will be unable to sustain current levels of resistance beyond the summer of 2026. And that is exactly the time when the financial crisis that I've just been talking about in this program, the financial crisis in Ukraine, is going to hit. Ukraine is left with about 6 months of space in order to pull things together before everything bad comes together and things start to fall apart. That is what I am being told about the military situation. That is the mathematics of financial support for Ukraine. The meeting that took place the day before yesterday in Brussels increasingly looks like the tipping point. Anyway, let's now go back briefly to the story of the negotiations, the great negotiations that the United States is engaging in, and what's going to come of this meeting by Dmitriev when he meets Witkoff and Kushner in Miami. By the way, there are reports that the President of the United States himself, Donald Trump, is heading to Florida. He says he's got a lot of work to do there. Most of it seems to be related to domestic matters. But the Russian media are speculating that he might want to meet Dmitriev himself in person to see whether he can get the Russians to budge. Well, I don't know what Dmitriev's instructions are, but it is important again to understand that Dmitriev is not a full-time official of the Russian government. He does not have plenary powers to negotiate on behalf of Russia. He can perhaps point the Americans in the right direction and point to them what about the present proposals is unacceptable. But the final decision rests with Putin and the Russian Security Council in Moscow. And they have made it crystal clear over the last couple of days that the various proposals the Europeans have been coming up with and the Ukrainians have been coming up with are completely unacceptable. They want the Ukrainians to withdraw from Donbass. They want the Ukrainians to withdraw from Zaporozhye and Kherson region as well. All of the stories about the Russians agreeing to a ceasefire in Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, never confirmed in any public place by any Russian official, claims that Larry Johnson at Sonar 21 said had no basis in fact, claims which Gordon Hahn, on his exemplary and outstanding Substack site, has also pointed out, never had any corroboration from any Russian government source. All of those claims we can now see were untrue. Now, Putin, over the course of the last week, over the course of the session of the session at the Ministry of Defense Board, and over the course of his Q&A and his press conference basically has laid it out again. It's the objectives set out at the beginning of the special military operation must be fulfilled. The Russian proposals, the Russian conditions set out by Putin himself at the speech he made to the Russian Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024, that those remain fully in place. Putin continues to talk about some concessions that the Russians made when he, Putin, met Trump in Anchorage. But I have to say bluntly now, increasingly, over the last couple of weeks, as the Russians have become more public about what was discussed in Anchorage, I have difficulty seeing that they actually conceded anything. I don't know what these concessions, what this flexibility that Putin and Lavrov and Ushakov are talking about, what it actually involves. Because I don't see any actual flexibility, any concessions coming from the Russian side at all. Trump has recently taken to grumbling that as the Russians advance, their position tends to harden. Could it be that he thought that the Russians were making more concessions in Anchorage than they are making now, that they have in effect taken back the concessions they made in Anchorage? Well, one day we will know, but frankly, I am not going to waste more time speculating about this and trying to analyse it. Suffice to say that the Russians are sticking with the set of proposals which we on the Duran refer to as Istanbul Plus. That's not, by the way, what the Russians have ever called it, and they remain as tough about them as ever, and they show no sign at all that they are prepared to concede or walk back from them. So, what Dmitriev is going to discuss with Witkoff and Kushner when he comes to Florida, it's difficult to see. I think the best that he could say is, look, that he's talked about it with Putin, but all of these proposals coming out of Europe, coming out of Ukraine, they simply won't fly. And if Kushner and Witkoff believe that they can take these to Putin in Moscow, well, probably the door on them will close before they arrive. They might as well not bother. Now, the Russians see everything. They see all of the things that I've just been talking about. They can add up, they can do the maths just as well as I have done. The Russians are, for one thing, extremely good at maths, just saying. They can see that the indications are that the West is reaching its limits in the financial support it can provide to Ukraine. They are aware of the limits on Western weapons procurement as well, and of the West's inability to continue to supply military supplies to Ukraine, which have also been dwindling away. They are aware too of the fact that the Ukrainian army is gradually melting away as it cannot replace losses and as more and more men desert from it. Kirill Budanov, the Ukrainian intelligence chief, has just made further bitter statements saying that the mobilization plan that Ukraine has been conducting over the course of the last 2 years has been a complete and disastrous failure. His comments actually are extraordinarily strong. And of course, the Russians also know about the configuration of the situation on the front lines. The Russians have also read the Americans' security strategic survey, the document that we've discussed and people continue to discuss exhaustively in so many places. They see and they know that the current administration says that stabilizing relations with Russia is for the United States a core interest. So the Russians know how strong their position is. Putin made it absolutely clear over the course of yesterday's press conference, in answer to a question from an American journalist, that he feels that his conscience with respect to the war is clear, that the Russians, Putin, did not start the war, did not start the conflict, that it was the Western powers that brought the conflict about, and Ukraine itself. Well, of course, there will be many people, including the American journalist who asked him that question, who will no doubt push back on all of that and will say that Putin is absolutely wrong and even lying about it. But that is what Putin is saying. So, given that this is so, what chance is there? What reason is there to think that the Russians are indeed going to make any concessions when they have a winning hand? And that brings me back now to the state of the war. We've had more news over the last 24 hours. And the first thing to say is that following the Russian attacks on the bridges around Odessa, the speculation on the internet is rife that we are about to see an amphibious operation by the Russians landing infantry in the south of Odessa region, the communications lines, the transport lines that the Ukrainians can use to try to stop the Russians if the Russians do land there. The bridges, they are being damaged. I understand they've not been destroyed, but transport cannot cross these bridges anymore. And, well, as I said, the speculation is that the Russians are in the process of preparing a bridgehead. Now, I'm going to say I myself continue to have some doubts about this, and I'll simply explain why. It's not because I think that the Russian Black Sea Fleet doesn't have the means to conduct an operation in the Black Sea. The Ukrainians still send their drones across the Black Sea, and their underwater drones. One of them one of them penetrated the harbour of Novorossiysk, as we know, a short time ago. It didn't destroy a submarine there. And the Ukrainians have launched attacks with these submarine drones against tankers in the Black Sea. By the way, on that, the Ukrainians also launched an attack using drones against a tanker off the coast of Libya. 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago, it was a tanker off the coast of West Africa. Now they've launched an attack on a tanker off the coast of Libya. This provoked, by the way, a very sharp reaction from Putin over the course of the press conference. He said this is not going to stop or materially affect Russian oil exports. It will result, however, in ship owners paying higher premiums on the insurance for their tankers. And the Russians will respond. Though he didn't outline what the response would be, but he indicated that they would respond sharply. And it may be that one of the ways they will respond sharply is by taking some kind of action against Odessa, action to close the port of Odessa, which, by the way, I understand, following the attack on the Turkish ship, merchant ship in Odessa, the port is indeed now almost closed. Anyway, it's not because the Ukrainians are capable of stopping the Russian Black Sea Fleet from conducting naval operations in the Black Sea in support of an amphibious operation. The Ukrainians do have some weapons at their disposal. They still have missiles, and it may be that they still have a stockpile of Storm Shadow and other missiles they could use against these Russian ships, these Russian warships and amphibious and landing ships. But it's always seemed to me, it still seems to me a very problematic thing to do, to conduct an operation of this kind in winter, at a time when sea conditions, even in a relatively enclosed sea like the Black Sea, must be far from perfect. There was a lot of speculation, similar speculation, a few weeks ago, as I remember, that the Russians were conducting some kind of amphibious operation in Kherson, in the city of Kherson, that they'd crossed the river, the Dnieper, that they'd established bridgeheads in the city of Kherson. No really strong evidence to confirm that ever appeared. I expressed my own doubts about whether the Russians would conduct an operation of that kind across a river in late autumn. And I have even bigger doubts about whether the Russians are planning to do something like that over a much wider territory near Odessa, across the Black Sea, to do it in winter. Having said that, the Russian General Staff does not share its plans with me. I have no doubt at all that the Russian Defense Ministry, the Russian General Staff, does have plans both for Kherson and Odessa. General Gerasimov, the Chief of the General Staff, appeared a couple of weeks ago with a map behind him showing Odessa and Nikolaev under Russian control. I've no doubt that that plan exists. I said some weeks ago, when Putin met with the senior military in St. Petersburg, he took them to the Peter and Paul fortress. He showed them the tombs of Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. Peter the Great managed to conquer much of the territory that now makes up Ukraine. And it was Catherine the Great who took over most of the rest, established the Russian presence on the Black Sea, annexed Crimea itself, and established the cities of Sevastopol and Odessa and Kherson. So clearly those plans do exist, and I suspect that these Russian operations that we are seeing related to Odessa are indeed preparatory for them, just as the rather similar operations that have been conducted in Kherson are preparatory for them too. But I don't expect this to happen over the next few weeks. My guess is late spring. May, maybe. I can't imagine that it's going to be done now. So, That's what I want to say about this. But it is very interesting that it is going on. Odessa itself appears to be experiencing prolonged blackouts. Some say a semi-permanent blackout. That might be true. There have been protests about it by some of the civilian population in Odessa. One way or the other, the shadow of the Russian army is falling on Odessa. And this must be causing growing worry and alarm in Kiev, even as everywhere else things continue to go wrong. Now, Putin again gave an overview about the military situation across the battlefronts over the course of his press conference yesterday. I'm not going to repeat in detail what he said. I touched on it in yesterday's program. As I said, he continued to speak of Kupiansk as being under Russian control, and he spoke about the Russians continuing to squeeze the Ukrainian forces caught in the cauldron on the east bank of the Oskol River and surrounded there. He also spoke about the Russians being in control of 50% of Liman and more than 50% of Konstantinovka. He said that he expects Liman to pass under Russian control very soon. And interestingly, he said that he expects that the Russian army is going to announce more victories this month before the new year. And, well, it could be that one of these victories is going to be announced within the next few hours. Because as a number of people are pointing out, the various Ukrainian mapping projects have now shown the entire territory of Myrnograd that was previously still contested. All of it has now passed into the grey zone. There is no part of Myrnograd that is shown as being under undisputed Ukrainian control. Now, when this has happened in the past, it's usually a sign that resistance has collapsed and that the Russians are about to take full control. And I wonder whether that is the situation with Myrnograd. The Russians have been saying that the Ukrainians over the last couple of days have been conducting unsuccessful attacks on northern Pakrovsk. Probably that is true. But if Myrnograd does indeed fall within the next few hours, well, in that case, we are looking at a situation where the entire Pakrovsk, Myrnograd conurbation will have passed entirely under Russian control. If that is indeed the case, then it's very difficult for me to see how Ukrainian resistance in the neighboring town of Konstantinovka, which the Russians say they now control more than half of, how resistance in Konstantinovka can be sustained for much longer. It's likely that Konstantinovka will also fall, probably some point this winter, early next year. So Putin is on a roll. Russia is on a roll. That was very much, by the way, the sense I got from the press conference yesterday. He sees that everything is coming together. His army is advancing on the front lines. The Ukrainian army, as he said to the Defense Ministry Board, is gradually disintegrating. The West is hitting its financial limits as to the degree of support for Ukraine it can provide. And the Russians sense that victory is close. There are many problems that they're going to have to face in the future, and we can't be sure, I am not sure, what victory exactly for the Russians in Ukraine is going to mean, what the shape of that victory is going to look like. But Putin clearly believes that he has a winning hand, and his comments over the last couple of days show it. Of course, if the Russians do establish a bridgehead in Odessa region and are able to threaten or perhaps even capture the city of Odessa, that is a big, big thing. Well, then, of course, the fact that he holds a winning hand would become indisputable. But my sense is that he thinks he has a winning hand already. In fact, I don't think anybody who followed the press conference closely and retains any sense of reality would doubt it. And the Russian central bank chair, Elvira Nabiullina, provided more clarification about the overall state of the Russian economy. I said in my program yesterday that when Putin said that the rate of inflation in Russia has fallen to 5.8%, or perhaps even 5.6%, it could be even as low as 5.6% by the end of the year. I said I wondered whether he was talking about the rate of price growth in December as opposed to the whole of 2025. Well, Elvira Nabiullina, the central bank chair, has now provided complete clarification. It will be 5.8 or 5.7 or 5.6% for the whole of 2025. Nabiullina said that in December, the rate of price growth, as compared with last year, is currently running at 4%, which is essentially the same as the central bank's target. So, the economy, as Nabiullina described it, stable, manufacturing continuing to grow, a good harvest in 2025, indications that inflation will stabilize further in 2026, and the central bank reserves now basically back at pre-2022 levels. They've strengthened further in the last year. They've actually grown, which is interesting and not entirely explained, but with the country continuing to run an overall surplus on its current account, perhaps that's not really so surprising. Debt to GDP ratio, according to Putin, has also fallen to 17.7%, compared with 120% in France, 140+% in Italy, around 100% in Britain, just under 100% in Britain, though the British figures get changed downward whenever it seems that the debt to GDP ratio is going to be above 100%, just saying. I don't think they're fully reliable. And, of course, German debt to GDP ratio also deteriorating. The Russians are in a very strong position. And as I said, in summary, on every front, my impression of Putin is that he thinks he has a winning hand. So, all the indications suggest that he is right. Of course, winning the war in Ukraine, as I said before, can throw up a whole host of other problems. But coming back to Witkoff and Kushner under Trump, perhaps they need to understand this and understand further that if we're talking about negotiations, Putin himself has no need to make concessions because he's about to sweep the whole board. Anyway, this is where I finish today's program. Be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also, by the way, and should also, by the way, check out our new Substack site. Please remember that you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. And please remember, as I said previously, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.